Hello, people. It's Perky Perkins. I'm back again. This time I have a story for you that was written by a friend of mine. My friend's name is Jim McClements. The title of the story is Love Bites. My name is Richard Gibson. I am 24 years old and have never been married. I was born in Boston. I was attending the local dance. The year was 1850. It was the middle of June, and the place was Boston, Mass. The dance was held at the Paul Revere Center. It had been a while since I attended any dances. I had recently broken up with Marla O'Toole, a bookstore clerk. We used to go dancing a lot. We had been dating for 2 years when we started to see things differently. Marla wanted to get married and have children, but I wasn't quite ready to settle down yet. I am a blacksmith by trade, and I wanted to open my own shop before I decided to settle down. We first met at the Christmas dance that was held over 2 years ago. When I came through the door, there were plenty of young women at the dance in their lace gowns and dresses of different styles and colors, while the men wore mostly black or gray suits. The band was dressed in blue suits and tails and white powdered wigs. It was a 5-piece band. They called themselves Beethoven's Fifth. They weren't the best, but they played some of the pieces fairly well. I saw a striking young woman named Linda Jackson. She was dressed in a light green gown. She had blonde hair and blue eyes. She had been standing by the dance floor watching other young couples dancing. I asked her to dance. She said, okay, and then we went to the middle of the dance floor and started dancing. The band was playing a lively tune. I'm not sure who it was by. She told me her name and said she was 18 years old. I told her about myself. The lively piece ended, and they started to play Beethoven. We danced through several other numbers, and she said she needed some air and thanked me for a nice dance. I bowed to her, and she laughed. The next tune the band started to play was Strauss. That was when I saw what I thought to be one of the most beautiful women I had ever seen. She was wearing a pink gown that had white frills and a slight neckline. She had black hair, and she wore her hair in a ponytail. She had very pale skin. She was also tall and very thin. She caught my eye. I could not look away. I gathered up all my will and walked up to her and asked if she wanted to dance. Yes, she said, that would be very nice. I gave her my name, and she told me her name. She said, my name is Elizabeth Steiner. Then she said, my name is Elizabeth Steiner. I asked, are you new here? No, she said, I've been living here for about 5 years. I used to live in Transylvania. She said, how about you? She said, how about you? She asked. I told her about myself and that I was a blacksmith and I had lived in Boston all my life. While we danced, I felt myself being drawn closer to her, more and more. There was something about her that kept my mind occupied. I noticed that other men were also finding it hard to keep their eyes away from Elizabeth. When the band had finished Strauss, they started to play a lively tune from Schubert. The night wore on, and we danced with several pieces of music, some familiar and some not so familiar. After a piece by Bach, I asked her if she wanted to get some refreshments. I would really enjoy that, she said. We walked over to the refreshment table, and I ladled some punch into a glass for her. What do you think of the band and the music? I asked. I think they're pretty good, Elizabeth said. Some of the other couples were also at the table. I nodded to them. Then I saw a couple that I knew, Bob Jacobs and his wife Jane. I worked with Bob at the blacksmith shop. We were both apprentices at the shop. Hi, Bob. How are you and Jane tonight? I asked. Pretty good. And you? Bob asked. I am fine, I said. Bob then asked, who's the lovely young lady on your arm? This is Elizabeth Steiner, I replied. So how is Richard treating you, Bob asked Elizabeth. "Richard is a pretty good dancer. He's very light on his feet," she replied. I kept noticing that Bob was looking at Elizabeth quite often. He too found it hard to keep his eyes off of her. I also noticed that Jane had observed this. She did not look too happy when he did the observing. There was something about Elizabeth, I don't know what it was, something unusual about her eyes that seemed to almost put men in a trance, myself included. I didn't have to work the next morning since it was Sunday. I always attend church. I thought of asking Elizabeth if she would attend church with me, and that we could also go out together sometime. I looked at the clock on the wall and was surprised to see it said 5 minutes to 12. That was when she asked me to step outside and get some fresh air. I asked Bob and his wife if they would like to join us. Bob said, "Sure, we can do that." Jane, however, had other plans. "Bob," said Jane, "we have to leave and be up early so that we can go to church." Bob reluctantly agreed and then wished me, Elizabeth, and myself a good night. Elizabeth and I went out onto the veranda. When we got onto the veranda, Elizabeth kept nuzzling up under my chin. She began kissing and hugging me. Before I knew what was happening, I felt a sharp pinch. After what seemed like forever, Elizabeth broke her embrace. I looked down at my shirt and saw drops of blood had flown down onto my shirt. I looked around for Elizabeth, but she had disappeared. I stumbled around, and then I said to myself, I need to see a doctor. I need to see a doctor quickly. I hurried down the stairs and headed down the street. I headed for the doctor's office that I knew to be on Main Street. I felt kind of sick and kept stumbling around. I felt like I was about to gray out, and then I almost blacked out, but I finally found his office, which was attached to his house. I knocked on his front door as loudly as I could. A minute later, I saw a kerosene lamp, and an instant later the door opened to reveal a rather plump woman with black hair and brown eyes. She shined the light on me and saw how pale I looked. She quickly admitted me and showed me to the doctor's office. She lit another lamp and told me to wait for Dr. Holmes. Dr. Edward Holmes had been a doctor here in town for the past 30 years. The office was medium-sized and had a maple desk which contained a pen and inkwell and some papers. The desk also had a large jar which contained a human brain and formaldehyde. There were counters that held medical tools that were crude and very sharp and very scary looking. There were shelves that contained jars that were filled with various organs from the human body. I had a weak stomach and turned my attention to a bookcase that contained volumes of medical books and the doctor's journal, which I assumed contained information about other patients. After about 15 minutes, the doctor entered the office. Dr. Holmes stood about 6 feet tall and was slender. He had brown hair and was graying at the temples. I guessed his age to be somewhere in the mid-40s. "Hello, Dr. Holmes," I said. "Hello, Richard," replied the good doctor. He said, "Now, what seems to be the problem?" I pointed to the marks on my neck. He noticed the blood was on my shirt, and he pulled out a magnifying glass that he had in his pocket. He held it over the mark on my neck. After looking at the marks on my neck, the good doctor turned to me and paled considerably. He reached over to one of the counters and grabbed a flask that was full of brandy along with 2 glasses. He poured a glass for each of us. After we both had a couple of swallows, he began to speak. He said, "I have some bad news for you, Richard." The doctor said, "The marks on your neck are the marks of the vampire." He continued. At first I just stood there thinking, and then it dawned on me what he said. I quickly finished off the glass, and the doctor filled my glass and his own again. The doctor started speaking again. He said, "You have been cursed, Richard. The only way to break the curse is to find the head vampire and drive a stake into his heart." I began to get a bad feeling. I grabbed the flask and took a huge gulp. I put the bottle down and left the office. I was heading to the foyer to leave the house. That's when I was struck from behind. I fell to the floor, and as fast as I could, I rolled onto my back and saw his wife had whacked me with a hammer. She was going to drive a stake into my chest. Dr. Holmes had a very sharp-looking stake in his hand. When he got close enough, I swept my leg to the side and kicked his leg out from under him. The doctor fell on his side. I quickly got up. His wife meant to whack me again. I didn't hold with hitting a woman, so I gave her a push when she pulled her arm back to strike me again. She fell backward and hit her head on the foyer wall and collapsed to the floor. By this time, the good doctor had gotten up, but instead of attacking me, he went to the aid of his wife. I knew the doctor would not have killed me under normal circumstances, but I understood he was doing it so that it would not hurt other people. I took the moment to leave in a hurry. I ran all the way home. I was out of breath when I went into my house. I walked up the stairs and reached my bedroom. I was still shocked at the realization that Elizabeth was a vampire. I fell asleep. My dreams were filled with vampires and other creatures of the night. When I awoke, I was still shocked at the realization that Elizabeth was a vampire. I fell back asleep and had strange dreams about vampires and other creatures of the night. When I woke up, I found it was morning and bright sunshine came through my window. The bright sunlight hurt my eyes when I went to the mirror to see if I looked as bad as I felt, only to see that I had no reflection. I knew that I was dying, and maybe I was already dead. I felt cold all over, and my skin was very pale and bloodless. I then went into the basement of my house to wait until dark. As twilight grew on, I began to feel hungry for blood. I knew my time was limited, and soon I would be just like Elizabeth and travel the endless night in search of blood. I should have realized that she was not all she seemed to be. I had heard about vampires that they did not like the sun. They liked cool, dark places and slept in coffins. The coffins were usually found in crypts. I decided I would have to find out where the head vampire stayed during the day and drive a wooden stake through his heart. I couldn't stand to be in daylight myself, so I had to set out after dusk. I knew I might have to drive a stake into my own heart so that I would not hurt others. I decided to go to the local graveyard and see if I could find the crypt that contained the head vampire. I set off at dusk and went to the nearby graveyard. I brought some wooden stakes that I had found in the place where I worked, along with a steel hammer. I searched all the crypts and even opened any coffins that I could find. It took a while, but I found what I was looking for. I found a rather large crypt and noticed it had an ornate decoration over the door. It was full of coffins. I took some matches out of my pocket and began to light the lamps. The crypts smelled of death and decay. I began opening the different coffins. The coffins contained people that had the same look as Elizabeth. I almost opened half the coffins when I heard a strange sound. I turned and saw that other victims were starting to come out of their coffins. The ones that had not been opened yet were opening, and those vampires were getting out as well. I steeled myself for a fight to my own death. The vampires ignored me and began leaving the crypt in search of blood. I saw that Elizabeth was leaving her coffin, and she saw me. "Come here, my love," she said. She pointed to a coffin that was next to hers. I noticed it was empty. I shook my head and said, "No, I have something I need to do." That was when the middle coffin opened. It was larger and more fancier than the rest of them. That was the one that contained the head vampire. That was the one that contained Dracula himself. He was wearing a cape that was black, and it had red lining. He was wearing a medallion around his neck. It had the same ornate figure that was over the doorway of the crypt. He lifted the lid with one hand and was starting to rise slowly. I moved as fast as I could over his coffin, readying my hammer and a wooden stake. Elizabeth realized what I had in mind and tried to stop me. I gave her a shove without thinking. She moved back, but not as far as I would have liked. By now, Dracula had sat up. He looked at me with his hypnotic stare. I was suddenly under his spell. I tried to will myself to snap out of it. I blinked my eyes and broke the partial spell. I found the surge of adrenaline pushed him back down and then drove the stake into his heart. Dracula rose up again and actually climbed out of his coffin and began to walk towards me. He was a head taller than me. He had the blackest hair, and he had pasty white skin and black eyes that matched his hair and his cape. I did not look into his eyes and fall into a trance. I hurried over to him. I hurried over and heard him begin to scream in pain. He had grabbed the arm with the hammer in it and began to press his nails into my skin. I took the hammer out of my left hand and into my right hand, and then I hit Dracula again with the hammer into the stake. I managed to drive the stake further in his chest and deeper in his heart. He let out a shriek with a sound that would have shattered glass. He then released me. That was when I felt a new pain. Elizabeth had grabbed my right arm and began to twist it, so I dropped the hammer. I then looked around and noticed I was surrounded by blood-sucking vampires. I was waiting for them to attack when they stopped in their tracks. Their eyes began to lose the blank look, and their skin began to take on a healthy look. The curse was now broken. I began to feel the life creep back into me. My skin started to look healthier. Elizabeth had let go of my arm and began to look around with a look of confusion on her face. She looked at the place where Dracula had. He lay upon his back with the stake in his chest and his hands that were clasped around the stake. His eyes were wide open with pain. He was now officially dead. Then he began turning to dust. Everyone in the crypt had watched this miracle in the works. Elizabeth then turned to me and said, "Is it really over, Richard? Is the spell broken?" I nodded. "It is, Elizabeth, it is. The nightmare is finally over." She began to smile, and she gave me a big hug and a kiss. She said, "Let's get out of here." I suggested we get out of here too. Elizabeth nodded to me and then started walking towards the entrance. The other people started to move out of our way. There were at least 20 of them. There were some others outside. When we left the crypt, we noticed a small knot of people standing around and looking down on the ground. Laying in front of the gravestone were 2 people. It was too dark to see who it was, so I returned to the crypt and grabbed a lantern that was on a hook that was on the wall. Then I walked over to the grave and shined the light on the ground, and noticed with some surprise to see Dr. Holmes and his wife. On closer inspection, I noticed they were both dead. Their necks had been broken. I heard a gasp from Elizabeth and saw that she had been standing next to me. I told Elizabeth about my adventures that I had with the doctor and his wife. That was when Elizabeth began to cry. I held her in my arms and let her cry until she could cry no more. She then apologized for hurting me and thanked me for breaking the curse and saving her and everyone else from a lifetime of hell. The other people in the crypt came out and began thanking me as well. There were people of all ages, even children. I began to think what to do about the bodies. There were going to be a lot of questions, and the police were not going to accept the vampire story. I decided to put the bodies in the crypt and stick them into 2 of the coffins. When this was done, I decided to go home. "Can I come with you?" she asked. "I don't really have anywhere to go. I don't currently have a home." I didn't have to be asked twice. Elizabeth and I said our goodbyes to the other people and then headed to my house. When we arrived at my house, I lit the lamps throughout the house, and then I went into the little kitchenette and made coffee for the both of us. Elizabeth was sitting in the parlor waiting for me to bring the coffee in. I set the coffee down on the table, and then turned to Elizabeth. "I will sleep here on the couch, and you can sleep in my bed. I'm not sure what I'm going to do about my future." "Can I stay with you until I do?" Elizabeth said. I didn't really have to think about it, even though she almost tried to kill me and turn me into a creature of the night. "You can stay as long as you need to, Elizabeth," I replied. Elizabeth stayed with me for a long time, and we did eventually get married and have 3 children. That's the story, folks. I hope you enjoy it. That story was by my friend Jim McClements.